Ever have one of those friends? You know, brilliant, funny, a little different,
Hmm.
someone who just never quite seems to like totally get the whole social thing.
Oh, yeah.
I did. Turns out she was later diagnosed with autism.
Wow.
And it really got me thinking, how often does this fly under the radar, especially with women?
Right, right. Because it's not always as obvious, is it?
Exactly. And it's so much more than just being a little quirky, right? It's like navigating a world that just wasn't built for you. That can be honestly pretty isolating.
Absolutely.
So, in this deep dive, we're doing something really important, I think, exploring those often overlooked signs of autism in women.
Yeah. Let's dig into that.
We're going way beyond those stereotypes, those kind of surface level understandings. And to help us do that, we're tapping into cheap ABA 10 signs of autism in women, Understanding Autism in Women, which, by the way, is a fantastic resource. Really gets into why those traditional diagnostic criteria, yeah, they often miss the mark. Big time.
It's true, and for a long time, the research focused so heavily on boys.
Which, come on, we know that men and women, their experiences, they can be worlds apart.
Exactly. Imagine, for decades, the very definition of autism was based on just one segment of the population.
It's no wonder so many women just slip through the cracks.
And the cost of that is huge. Think about it. Women going their whole lives feeling like they just don't quite fit in. Their struggles, their feelings, dismissed as being too sensitive or, overly dramatic.
Oh, absolutely, and how much that impacts your sense of self.
It's profound. Your self-esteem, relationships, your identity, everything. It's like being told your reality is just dot off.
Like you're playing life on hard mode and you don't even know why.
Exactly. And tragically, a lot of women, they internalize that. They blame themselves for not being able to keep up, for feeling exhausted by things that seem so effortless for others.
It's heartbreaking, honestly, and what kills me is they often develop these elaborate coping mechanisms,
Oh, absolutely. They become masters of disguise
masking their true selves just to get by.
because that's what society often demands, isn't it?
And that masking, that constant effort to appear normal, cheap ABA, really emphasized how exhausting that is. It's no surprise that women with autism experience higher rates of things like anxiety and depression. It's like this silent epidemic.
It truly is. But there's a glimmer of hope here, right? The source also talks about how life-changing a proper diagnosis can be for these women.
Oh, absolutely. Like finding the missing puzzle piece. Finally.
It's validating. It's relief. Permission to be yourself, finally.
That's like, oh, it's not just me. There's a reason things have always felt this way.
Exactly. A diagnosis isn't about slapping on a label. It's about understanding. It's about getting access to support, to strategies, to a community.
To people who genuinely get it, who've been there.
Yes.
And that's what this is all about, right? Reclaiming your narrative. But it all starts with understanding the signs. So let's get into those 10 signs of autism in women that cheap ABA lays out. Knowledge is power, as they say. Okay, so 10 signs, right? Where do we even start?
Well, the source, cheap ABA, it kicks off with social difficulties,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is interesting, right? Because we often jump to this idea of, oh, someone with autism is withdrawn or they don't like people. But it's way more nuanced than that.
Right. It's not just about being a little shy or hating parties.
Exactly. Let's say, for example, you're at one of those big networking events.
Ugh, the worst.
Right. But imagine, for someone with autism, it's not just the small talk that's difficult. It's the constant effort to decode those subtle social cues, facial expressions, body language.
Oh, totally. It's like everyone else got a memo that you didn't.
Yes. It's like trying to understand a foreign language, but with half the dictionary missing.
And then on top of that, your senses are going haywire.
Oh, absolutely. That sensory sensitivity can be huge.
That's actually the next sign on the list.
And it makes sense, right? Because if you're already struggling to process social information, and then you throw in, like, movie theater, for example.
Yeah.
The flickering lights, the surround sound, people crunching popcorn. For someone with sensory sensitivities, that's not a fun night out.
More like sensory overload central.
Exactly. And it's not just disliking certain sounds or textures, right?
Yeah.
It's about those sensations causing genuine distress, even pain.
Cheap ABA mentions some women describe it like having all their senses cranked up to 11 all the time. It makes you look at everyday life in a whole new light, doesn't it?
It really does. And you can imagine how that then impacts, say, sleep, which is not coincidentally another one of the signs we see.
Oh my gosh, sleep. That's something I think most people struggle with at some point or another, but for people with autism, it's often this whole other level.
Because it's neurological, right? Those racing thoughts, the inability to just tune out all that sensory input. It's not just about having a cup of chamomile tea and hoping for the best.
Right? It's not a matter of willpower.
Exactly. It's like trying to fall asleep in a room full of buzzing lights and ticking clocks, but those distractions are coming from inside, not outside.
Wow. Okay, so then there's this one that I think is really interesting, eye contact. Because on the one hand, we're told it's polite. It shows you're paying attention.
Right, right. Look him in the eye. That's what we hear. But
But then on the other hand, Cheap ABA was talking about how for some women with autism, eye contact can feel incredibly intrusive,
totally, like an invasion of your personal space.
like a spotlight shining right into your soul.
Yes. So it's no wonder they might avoid it or, find it really uncomfortable. And then, of course, it's seen as being rude or whatever.
And another example of how those social rules don't always translate well across the board.
Totally. And speaking of things that can be tricky, emotional regulation. Cheap ABA really digs into this one.
As they should, because we all have emotions, but when you're on the spectrum, it can be like they're broadcasting at full volume all the time.
Exactly. It's like the volume knob on your emotions is stuck.
So those little annoyances that most people can just brush off.
They can feel monumental.
Absolutely. And then that can lead to stimming behaviors, which is another sign Cheap ABA highlighted. And they made an interesting point that in women, these behaviors are often more subtle.
It's true. You're less likely to see, like, hand flapping or rocking, which might be more common in boys, and more likely to see things like hair twirling, fidgeting with jewelry.
Right, or even more internal stims, like repeating phrases in their heads, things like that. But it's important to remember, stimming isn't just some weird quirk, right? It serves a purpose.
Absolutely. It's a way to regulate all that sensory input, to find a bit of calm in the chaos.
But unfortunately, it's often misinterpreted. So women with autism, they might feel pressure to suppress these behaviors, which ironically can actually backfire.
Totally. It's all connected. And this often ties into those more invisible struggles, like the anxiety and depression that we see at much higher rates in women with autism.
And honestly, is it any surprise when you think about it? It's like you're constantly feeling like you're one step behind, like everyone else got the instruction manual and you're just winging it.
And then add on the pressure to mask, the exhaustion of navigating all those social situations.
Just sensory overload.
It's a recipe for burnout.
And we haven't even gotten to executive function yet, which Cheap ABA talks about. This is a big one, right?
Yeah.
Because we're talking about those mental processes that most of us take for granted. Planning, organization, time management, focus.
Yes. And these can be real challenges for women with autism.
So imagine struggling to break down even simple tasks into manageable steps.
Right? Or starting one thing, getting sidetracked, and then feeling totally overwhelmed by the mental clutter. It's a lot.
It's like having a million tabs open in your brain, but you can't close any of them.
Exactly. And of course, this then impacts every aspect of your life. Your job, relationships, everything feels harder.
And when you're constantly hitting those roadblocks, it's easy to see how that would chip away at your self-esteem.
Absolutely. It really highlights just how critical it is to identify and support these challenges early on, which unfortunately doesn't always happen.
It's like you're trying to function in a world that wasn't quite designed for you, and it takes so much extra effort just to keep up.
It's like running a marathon with a weighted vest, and no one can see it but you. And it's exhausting. Speaking of exhausting, this next sign, it's often misunderstood. Obsessive interests. And Cheap ABA makes it clear this isn't just, oh, I love to knit, or I'm really into collecting stamps.
Yeah, it's never level.
Exactly. It's that intensity of focus that can be, honestly, hard for neurotypical people to fully grasp.
I mean, I might be passionate about podcasts, but I'm probably not spending every free minute researching microphone acoustics, you know?
Exactly. But for someone on the spectrum, that depth of knowledge, that passion, it can be so fulfilling.
It's true. It's like finding your thing, the thing that just truly lights you up.
Absolutely. But it's a double-edged sword, right? Because while it can be this incredible source of joy, it can also lead to isolation if it's not understood or appreciated by others.
That's so true. It's all about finding that balance, I guess, honoring those passions, but also, navigating a world that often values being well-rounded.
Right, being a jack of all trades, even if you're meant to be a master of one.
And that, I think, leads us to the last sign on the list. And it's a big one. It's something we've kind of touched on throughout this whole conversation, camouflaging. And I feel like of all the signs, this one is the most hidden.
Oh, absolutely. It's the invisible struggle.
Because essentially, it's social mimicry. It's like you're observing how everyone else behaves, how they interact, and then you're trying to do the same, even if it feels completely unnatural.
Yes. And women, especially, for so many reasons, They feel this pressure to be socially adept, to be agreeable, to be easygoing,
Hmm.
to fit in.
So imagine you're dealing with all these other challenges we talked about, the sensory overload, the social cues, the emotional regulation. And then on top of that, you're constantly monitoring your every move, your every word, like you're always on stage.
It's exhausting. And as Cheap ABA points out, it can come at a huge cost. A lot of women who are really good at camouflaging, they end up feeling like they're living a double life, never truly able to be their authentic selves.
It's like you're always performing, but the show never ends. And that takes a toll. So I think that's what makes this whole conversation, this whole deep dive into autism in women so crucial.
Absolutely. I mean, we've just scratched the surface here.
Just dipped our toes in the water.
Exactly. But hopefully it'll spark more conversations, more understanding.
Because knowledge is power. And when we start to recognize the signs, when we stop trying to force people to fit into these boxes that don't quite fit, then we can start to create a world where...
Where neurodiversity is celebrated, not just tolerated.
Exactly. Where being different isn't a bad thing, it's just different. And that actually makes me think, like, what if instead of trying to make those square pegs fit into those round holes, we just not embrace the unique shape of every single mind?
Love that.
Right. What if we shifted our perspective that way? So if this deep dive resonated with you, don't let it end here. There's a whole world of information out there. Connect with others, keep asking questions. You know the drill. This is the deep dive. We're all about that shortcut to being well informed. So until next time, stay curious, friends. And if there's a topic you're dying to explore, you know where to find us.